All right, everybody, welcome to another show on Hair Metal Revolution. Here we're talking more Van Halen, and we're gonna dive deep into what I like. I love behind the scenes stuff, like the transition years. We all know most of the forefront type of Van Halen stories, but it's always interesting to me stuff like behind the scenes. And Steve, on my channel, I put two shorts every day, different bands. It's not all Van Halen. High percentage of them are Van Halen, but I love putting shorts out because there's things that you kind of like, even though you heard it before, like you know what, I never thought about it like that in today. Like because your mind thinks differently. And one of the things that I downloaded this morning, it's so interesting to me, and I want to share it with you. I want to get your opinion about it. And let me do a share screen video file. You see here, and I named it. Here we go.
Rock and roll in recent years has kind of taken a backseat to pop, to hip hop. Do you think it can make a comeback?
I think it has gone away, come back so many times. I would bet anything that it's coming back.
Do you think?
Don't forget, we got signed in the middle of punk and disco. They laughed at us. What are these guys doing? Playing rock and roll? It's Get Down Tonight, man. KC and the Sunshine Band.
Which you used to play, right? When you were doing covers?
It sounded like Black Sabbath when we did it. That's another thing, in the club days, we had to play top 40 to get to gigs, and it was impossible for me to emulate what these records. I could not make, for the life of me, I tried so hard to make the songs we had to play, to make them sound like the record. But it was also a blessing in disguise, because all I could do was me. No matter what I played, it sounded like me. And that's why whenever you hear Van Halen, it's Van Halen, because that's all we can do. You hear Alex's drums, it's his drums. It's just the nature of the beast.
And the reason that intrigues me, because we all think of grunge, right? Seattle grunge, where it came in and that kind of like took over music. It hurt a lot of bands, but we kind of forget that every 10 years or 15 years, there's always type of new music in a way that kind of like takes over. And it was interesting when Eddie was talking about in 78, I was 5 years old, so I didn't really take it in at that time, but punk rock and new wave, they call it the British second wave that came in, especially when MTV comes, that was the kind of like the new wave of music, and rock was kind of like got behind, right? Because Aerosmith kind of got left behind. I know there were some drug problems. Kiss was following disco. Kiss made that, no offense, if people are Kiss fans, Dynasty to me was a horrible album. I Hate Myself for Loving You, hate that song. But you kind of forget that Van Halen actually started between the punk era, and like Eddie said, they were laughed at like rock's not gonna make it, but they just didn't make it. They freaking rocked it. So and you knew them like since 77. Was punk rock and new wave kind of scary like bands said grunge was in the 90s?
You bring up a lot of interesting points, Eric. Yes, if we look back at history, every 10 years, it's kind of a sea change.
Yeah.
Right. And I just had this conversation with my brother, and I'm not real knowledgeable about music from way back when, but if you go from like the 40s to the 50s, there's a huge change. I think if you think of the music from the 50s, it's a lot of those crooners and a lot of doo-wop stuff. And then you go from the 50s to the 60s, and you think about, all the stuff that was happening in San Francisco and all of those bands that were coming around, and the English bands, my God, from the 50s to 60s, it's like you're on an entirely different planet. And yeah, a lot of those artists from the 50s they kind of disappear. I think one of the salient points here is a great band will survive those changes. When I say a great band, I mean a classic, legendary band who goes kind of above and beyond what is happening at the time. So Van Halen, look, we're still talking about Van Halen 50 years after they first got together. We're not talking about many bands from the 70s, but yes, Van Halen came up in that era, and maybe it's pretty well known. Warner Brothers had no hope at all for this band, Van Halen.
No.
Right? And Edward talks about it, and I write about it in the book. Yeah, man, they thought we were a punk band, and the original logo they had was some kind of a punked out logo thing. That's what Warner's thought Van Halen was or should be, and they said we're not doing that. That's not who we are. It's funny because when I met Edward the very first time, which is July 1977. They had already signed the deal on Warner's, but the first record wouldn't be out right for another, 8 months until February 78. So I met Edward before that first record comes out, before they go on that first tour. But it's kind of odd that I was even at the Whiskey that night, because every night at the Whiskey from around that time were punk bands. And again, I don't want to insult any punk fans out there. I never got the punk thing. It didn't do anything for me. Look, some of those bands, the Sex Pistols at moments, I mean, I don't know if we can call the Clash a punk band. Some of that stuff had some merit, but for me, it was like Rebels without a cause. It was like, well, I'm going to spit and not learn my instrument, and that's going to be cool. And obviously that attracted an audience. But yes, they came up in a period when the odds were against them. But again, they were so unique, that there was just something about Edward and the band they were going to endure. And
they never chased the fad, right? I mean, no offense against Kiss. Kiss did that when disco came in. They wanted to change the disco. They kept chasing bands in the 80s. They didn't stay who they are. Yesterday on my channel, I posted, it's Bon Scott's birthday yesterday on the 9th. And I always post, usually on somebody's birthday, I'll post a poll or I'll post a video. And the punk thing came up again with Bon Scott on the clip I played yesterday, like asking them, were you scared when punk came out? And Bon Scott, the coolest guy he is, he's like, we drew fans before punk hit the scene. We drew more fans during the punk scene. And I think we did well for ourselves. You know what I mean? So punk, like grunge, was a thing. And you're right. Punk, like any other kind of music, there's so many different varieties of type of punk. Like, can you call Green Day punk? Yes, but they're more all around,
Yeah.
like kind of like people say like Social Distortion's punk. No, they're more rockabilly than like straight punk. And you said the Clash is not like in your face type of punk. So
Right.
There is different varieties of punk music. Some people used to call Black Sabbath a little punk, you know what I mean? And like hard, heavy. At the end of the day, it is all music, but it's just fascinating how Van Halen was phased by grunge. I remember our last show, I said Balance outsold the FUCK album. Now it's 95 in the heart of grunge. They get signed in the heart of punk and new wave. It doesn't phase them.
Yeah, absolutely. You bring up, you mentioned AC/DC, which kind of ties in to my relationship with Edward. So in July 78, it's a Day on the Green show with AC/DC is opening, Van Halen, Pat Travers, Aerosmith, and Mick Jones. So I had met Edward in July 77, about a year earlier. I was at that Day on the Green show to interview Mick Jones for Guitar Player magazine, which I had been writing for several years by that time. But I knew that Van Halen was playing, so I thought, oh great, I'm going to be able to, I'm going to see Edward again, So I'm there, and I go back, and my friend Niels Lozau was there. Neil is shooting Van Halen. He was their official photographer, and we go back, and I say hello to Edward, and you can see that picture actually on the back of the cover, I think, of the second edition of the book. There's Edward and me standing there at the Day on the Green, and I wanted to see Van Halen play. So AC/DC was on. They go on. I'm back there with Edward. He has to get ready. So I'm leaving kind of their private compound. I'm going to go out to the front of the stage because I want to see Van Halen play. The publicist for AC/DC kind of grabs me, says, hey, do you want to interview Angus? Well, again, I don't want to piss off any AC/DC fans here. I've never been an AC/DC fan. I don't get it. Hey, I respect their success. I mean, my God, they've had success like few bands in the world, but I just never got them. So for me to interview Angus Young, I had no desire. But I said yes because the publicist had a bunch of other bands I wanted to interview down the road. So, back in the day it was like a community between journalists and publicists and labels. Everybody really did meet each other. So I go back and I'm talking with Angus, and I brought up that question with him. Something about punk, and I think he said, "Hey man, we're like the original punks, not really, but they were aware of it. In fact, Bon Scott sort of joined the conversation late. I'm sitting there talking with Angus, and we're at a picnic table, and this guy jumps up on the table, and I think it's just some backstage person, and he's got a beer, and the beer's spilling out, and it's like spilling on my cassette player. And I'm waiting for Angus to tell this guy to leave, or somebody to get rid of this guy, So we're talking, and then, he kind of sits down next to Angus, and I'm thinking, what the fuck? Why doesn't Angus get rid of this guy? We're trying to do an interview. And, and I'm about to say to the guy, hey man, listen, I'm talking to Angus Young here. And the guy puts out his hand and goes, hi man, I'm Bon Scott, I didn't recognize him. But anyway, it's funny. And I also did an interview with Jeff Beck, and he called himself the original punk. Obviously, Jeff Beck was not a punk, but it's.
Well, they call Johnny Cash original punk too because the rebellion side.
There you go. And I mean, the reality is punk kind of disappeared pretty quickly by the kind of the mid '80s there. And I mean, you had all those other bands, Dokken and. Rat, and so the punk thing kind of went away pretty quickly. But
it basically molded itself because if you listen to like Motley Crue's first album, Too Fast for Love, they got a song called Public Enemy #1 that is that kind of style of punk. Music involves.
Yeah.
Good musicians will learn they could do more than just 3 chords. It's a fact that the Ramones learned to play when they were doing their music. They didn't know how to play. So it makes sense that they always played 3 chords. And it makes sense that Motley Crue from the beginning, they did songs that could have been considered punk and they got better. Mick Mars, went from here to here. Their music involves. Good bands, music involves. That's just a fact. And it's kind of funny. I actually have another shirt coming out later today at 2 p.m. with Eddie again. They talk about Warner Brothers when they're signing them that they didn't know what they have. But what? So since I got you here, I want to know like the truth, not the truth, but Gene Simmons makes a claim that I discovered Van Halen, but Van Halen didn't I know it didn't work out, didn't really sign with them. They signed with Warner Brothers. So did Gene Simmons really have an input in getting them signed with another record label like Warner Brothers? Or is that just Gene Simmons trying to get credit for everything?
That's Gene Simmons trying to get credit for everything. Gene Simmons did not discover Van Halen. That's, that kind of a comment is ridiculous. Did Gene Simmons recognize that there was talent there? Yes. Did he fly them to New York for a day to record demos? Yes. Did Bill Aucoin, Kiss's manager, pass on the band because he didn't see the potential? Yes. Did that piss the fuck out of Edward? Yes, because I wrote my book with Edward. It was all about respect. And to him, that was the ultimate disrespect. And I honestly, I think had they signed to Bill Aucoin's management, I think that could have been really bad. I don't care how big Kiss were at the time. I think that would have been a huge mistake.
No,
But
I mean,
but yeah, Gene did not discover them. Did he open that door? Did that demo somehow filter to Warner's and, oh hey, this band recorded a demo of Gene Simmons? Did that carry any weight? I don't think so. I think when Mo Austin came down to the Starwood that night with Ted, I don't think they had a clue about that demo, and
if
they
people
instantly
watch,
recognized.
if people watch my Shark Today at 2 p.m., Eddie talks about what he believes why Warner Brothers finally signed him, and it makes more sense because I mean, Gene Simmons. Even like I know Cinderella is not ever as big as Van Halen, but you know you try to take credit for them. And when that band met with them, they said that Gene Simmons, no offense, wanted to write the music, wanted to write the songs, and they said no, we're not going with you. I could imagine Gene trying to tell Eddie, "Let me write the songs, like write the music." Hell no, because like what Eddie said in that one clip we just played, that people would hear Van Halen, they recognize the music. You could tell that I'm playing, But I think that's a question. I was looking at album sales, and how did Diver Down sold over 4 million copies versus their album Fair Warning that only sold 2 million copies? I'm blown by that in a way. I didn't really realize that. I'm like, I'm not putting down Diver Down, but it did have over 5 covers. How did an album with 5 covers sold double than Fair Warning that's original?
That's exactly why it sold double, because it did have the covers, and people recognize that. Edward despised it because he told me, he goes, I'd rather fail with my own music than cover somebody else's. And obviously, all those early years, that's all he was doing was covers, and he was kind of sick of it. I wanted to return to the Gene Simmons comment for just 1 minute. After all that happens, and Bill Aucoin passes on the band, and I write about this in pretty much depth in the book. So when I was talking with Edward about this, it was still pretty recent history. I think I probably talked to him in one of the first interviews I did with him, probably 79 or 80. So it's not like from a distance he was looking back. It was fairly recent history. And then Gene Simmons came back at him again, and Gene wanted to manage them or produce them or something. And Edward, and again, he talks in the book that, there was no way that was going to happen after the way that Aucoin disrespected him. But the reason they Diver Down solos is because people recognize those songs. Edward may have hated doing the covers.
Bad covers, but to me, there was just too many. I'd rather hear all original Van Halen songs than.
But you're a hardcore Van Halen fan. The people who bought that record knew Pretty Woman and knew the Kinks song. I mean,
Yeah, so. Yeah, and that's really like broke the camel where Eddie was like, you know what, I know he was building 5150 when the cracks were happening with Fair Warning, and he like, no. I'm making my 5150 studio. We're going to keep the executives out. We're not going to give them, we're only going to give them a taste of a copy when we're done recording the songs. So in a lot of ways, you could say Diver Down kind of shifted where Eddie's like, I'm done. No more covers. No more. Because with Sammy Hagar, they have no covers. Unless there is one. I don't remember any cover that they did with Sammy during their 4 albums, but they're like, forget the covers. We're better than that.
Yeah, and I don't know if I ever had this conversation with Edward about Diver Down, but Edward ultimately relenting to all those covers could have also said that maybe there wasn't a lot of original songs written for that record,
Well,
and
didn't
so
he
maybe it
say
was.
that during that time when David was like never really around, so they couldn't really get creative, getting everybody back together until they kind of had to like force David to come during the 1984 album.
Well,
Yeah,
yeah, and again, I talked to Edward about that a lot, and he told me that yeah, he was really dissatisfied with Dave's input. He's supposed to be there doing pre-production on an album, and Dave's off climbing a mountain.
yeah,
And
and
again, that translates into respect and disrespect, and Edward never let go of
no,
disrespect. It
no,
was
we know when the Van Halen brothers disagree or hate something, they'll let you know. And it's a fact, right? I know Jump is huge. David sings it whenever he does a show, but in the beginning, David Lee Roth and Tim Templeton did not like Jump, right? They thought this is going to ruin Van Halen before they knew it was a hit. Is that correct? That
That is
they,
correct. They said, "Hey man, you're a guitar hero. You can't play keyboards." And I think even and I'm not exactly positive, but I think even Alex was a little shy about having Edward.
that change is hard.
And there was the other song in 1984, "I'll Wait," which I think is one of the best songs on the record.
Yes.
Um, uh, Ted and Dave, they hated the song, and so Edward just put that together with engineer Don Landy, and I mean it's an incredible song. I could see why they would hate it because it's a little different than not softer, but it's a little more melodic than those other songs on 1984. It was just it was a very good song, and they didn't understand it, And Edward said, "Fuck you, I'm doing it." So by 1984, Edward certainly was steering the ship. A lot more forcefully. He let a lot of stuff go by in those early days. He had an incredibly focused vision, but he allowed a lot of leeway. Actually, more leeway than I would have imagined. I mean, there were things Dave did and Michael, and he recognized all their input. But I think he put up with a lot, and he talked to me about that, and I wrote about that, and this he's talking about this in the moment when it's not like he talked about it years and years later. It's like the third or fourth record's out, and he's talking about fractures in the band.
Yeah.
Obviously, I never wrote about any of that. I never used any of that. I used it later in 2020 when I wrote the book, but yeah, there were issues early on. I mean, it wasn't smooth sailing, and the same with Sammy. With Sammy there was a short honeymoon period, and that fell apart. So
Yeah. You know, and I mean, unless you're a Van Halen nerds, a lot of people don't know, Eddie, before guitar, I put clips out when Eddie talks about when he was a kid, him and Alex were put in contests with his piano playing. And Eddie actually won a lot of contests as a kid playing piano.
yeah, absolutely. And again, I think that's one of the first or second interviews I ever do with him. Edward, yeah, man, when did you start playing this and that? And there's some amazing stories about him entering those piano contests as a young kid and beating out all these other people. And I said, did it ever mean anything to you? He goes, no, not really. I think early on he knew he wasn't going to play classical piano, which is what his parents wanted him to play, which is what he was playing. And they took lessons from a pretty significant
Yes.
classical teacher.
Yeah.
So,
And
but
Eddie was telling a funny story. It's in my clip that I put out last week that he would watch the piano teacher teach. Eddie wasn't learning how to read the music scripts. He learned by watching his hands. And one day he asked Eddie to turn the page or something, and Eddie didn't know how to read. He's like, "What do you mean? I've been teaching you for a year, 2 years." Because I was just watching you. It's like that's a legend where you just watch somebody and it makes sense, right? The way he plays that guitar, and I think being that piano player really helped him develop his fingers even more. You know what I mean? Because he understands the sound he can create with every single finger than just, your typical hold here and play here. I think that piano really played a part of him playing that guitar the way he does.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and beyond that, so he's learning all these classical pieces. All of that harmony is getting stuck in his head too. So you're hearing all these changes, even on those earlier records that you would not normally hear in typical rock bands. There's a lot of sort of those altered chords, and there's ninths and what are jazz chords that you wouldn't expect to hear there. And his songwriting. Was certainly expanded by his keyboard playing in a big way.
Oh, what happened to the stream? It's back. Oh, did we go off for a little bit? I'm seeing here that we are definitely live, but some people said maybe went off. But I mean, I don't know. We're live. I got a double screen to make sure that we are live, so we are on. So I want to start getting into a little bit of the transition year because some of the stuff is so interesting to me because one of the questions I want to get right before the transition from David to Sammy, and I don't know if this story is real or fake or not, and I know you know the answer. So after 1984, there's different stories that David Lee Roth was practicing with Steve Vai and Billy Sheehan, and he didn't quit Van Halen yet. They were actually like making some music and stuff. And is there any truth to that? Was he really like kind of like making music behind the back of Van Halen?
I've never heard that. I think that's ridiculous because well, one, Edward would have caught wind of it somewhere. He was very good friends with Billy Sheehan.
And I wanted to clear that up. I just wanted to clear that up.
I think that's garbage. That wouldn't happen. That never happened. So
I know they made a pact. Like Eddie said, they made a pact that they wouldn't do other projects unless they all knew, except when he did the Beat It thing. He said nobody was in town. So, he made that joke like, I didn't really break the rule there. There was nobody in town to say no. So, and of course, Davey was like, how come you're not taking not claim, but, a percentage for playing guitar on Beat It?
Yeah, that was pretty weird. I mean, Edward playing on Michael Jackson's record makes perfect sense. Quincy Jones was a genius for orchestrating that. What I can't understand. So even if Edward didn't ask to be paid, how is it that
management
or the label after the fact didn't say, you're not using Edward Van Halen's solo on that song unless he gets, a penny a record, whatever it was. That is what I can't understand.
And who knew that album was going to hit beyond anybody's beliefs?
Yeah, I mean, even if it sold 15 records, and Edward made, 50 cents off it, I don't know how that would slip by management or the label. That was just ridiculous.
And talk about management. What's kind of weird is so when David decided, or decide they're going to split, he's gone on his own. During that time, up to 1985, they were managed by a guy named Noel Monk. But as soon as David left, Noel Monk left the band, and their new manager, Ed Leffler, was Sammy Hagar's manager. And I'm always intrigued, like, how did that happen? Was when David left, was Noel like dedicated to David? He didn't want to be a band without David. Do you know anything about like they go from that manager to Sammy Hagar's manager? That's kind of interesting. Like, how did that happen?
So again, I write about this in depth in Tonechaser. On any given day, Noel left or Noel was fired. Edward thought that Noel was getting too big a piece of the pie. I think of the piece that he was getting as much as the band was, which is ridiculous to me. So Noel leaves, and Sammy comes in and brings his own manager. And again, I write about this in the book. To me, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. How can you possibly allow a new singer to come in and bring his own manager. As it turned out, Ed Leffler was a great manager.
But you didn't know that at the time. I mean, they didn't know
No,
that.
no, he didn't. But Ed was really instrumental in keeping the band together. There were fractures. Um, I mean, I think he really cared about the band. But what it reveals about Edward, and again, I write about this in the book, and I mentioned this earlier, that Edward sometimes took the path of least resistance, and instead of looking for a manager, which he could have done. I mean, who wouldn't want to manage Van Halen at that point?
No kidding.
Sammy comes in and says, "Hey, I've got a manager," and Edward just accepts it sight unseen. And Ed would do that kind of stuff. He would just kind of take the easy way out is how I describe it. And I thought it was, I go, why would you? How could you do that? How could you allow the singer to come in, a new member, to come up with his own management? But he did, So
I mean, sometimes, I'm not saying Eddie's not a leader. I'm not saying that at all. But there are certain people are better musicians than being a leader. Some people are better businessmen than not. And one thing Sammy does have, he's a great businessman. He's a great business mind. He buys, sells. I mean, most of his fortune is technically not from the music. The music gave him the money to purchase some of the stuff, like the tequila, where he made most of his money. Maybe Eddie just didn't, like you said, maybe he just didn't care about the management, the business stuff. He just wanted to play music. He just wanted to get in the studio, play guitar, and just record.
I mean, I think that's, on the surface, that's certainly true. But even when Dave left and Edward and the band was looking for a singer, and again, I write about this in the book, Edward said, "Hey, man, go find me a singer." I thought he was joking. It was just like, yeah, go find me. It's like, "Sure, Ed, I'll find you a singer." And he goes, "No, seriously, go find me a singer." Edward Van Halen could have had any singer in the world, and honestly, he reached out to me to go find him a singer. Had I thought that he was more serious, I would have put more of an effort into it. As it was, I think I maybe found one singer and played him a tape that he hated. But it's like, look, I can get not wanting to participate in the business of the band, but a singer who's going to be a part of the band, you wouldn't want a hand. And there's the famous story of they shared the mechanic. So what if they didn't have the same mechanic? What if Sammy drove Camaros and Chevys and Ed was driving Lamborghinis and didn't need an exotic car mechanic? They would have gotten. You know what I mean? I thought that was.
Those stories are true. That a mechanic said, "Hey, you should call this guy Sammy."
Yeah, I mean, I believe there's still some of the other wrinkle in there. Look, Edward knew Sammy from the first, opening for Montrose back in, their paths crossed in '78 and 2. They must have
the same producer, Tim Templeton, with the Montrose and Van Halen. So they had connection.
Was a common thread. So I mean, I think it was more than just sharing a mechanic, but yeah, I mean, Ed. I think for Edward to have gotten on the phone and called up various singers that he knew or liked to set up an audition, I just think that was beyond him. Not that he was stupid in any way, because he wasn't, but it was just, he just was not wired in that way. And so, his mechanic says, "Hey, I know a singer." He goes, "Oh, great. Let me listen to him," which is also weird because Edward told me that he really, really did not like Sammy's writing of Sammy's solo stuff. He goes, "Yeah, man, I don't like his songwriting." And I thought, you're getting this guy in your band and you don't like his songwriting. I thought that was an odd thing to say. So it wasn't like he was a huge fan of Sammy's solo work. He liked the Montrose records, but Sammy's solo stuff later on, Edward never cared about it. So strange cat, who knows what was in it.
And then what's interesting is if a lot of people are watching don't know this, for Sammy to join the band, he was still contracted under Geffen Records. And part of the contract deal for him joining Van Halen, he still had to make them one more album. And so he made an album between 5150 to OU 182 called "I Never Say Goodbye," which Eddie Van Halen played bass on it. So if people didn't know that, Eddie Van Halen played bass and some guitar on the song "Eagle Fly." He got credit for some guitar work on "Eagle Fly," but what is so interesting is I want to kind of I want to get in deep with you on this one. So I'm going to play this clip of Sammy Hagar talking about Eagle Fly, and there's something interesting in there about Alex Van Halen, and I thought it was very interesting. So let me just show you what I'm talking about. Let me go here. This is a clip that I played last week, and here it is.
Going back to the studio, and I was showing Eddie Van Halen was going to play bass on this record, I Never Say Goodbye, my last Geffen record. Then Van Halen was going to make our next record, OU 812, but I had to make the record first. So I remember I'm at the studio and I'm playing it for Ed, and Alex is standing in the background, and I'm going, the sun in the morning, 9 a.m., guitar acoustic. I saw fire in the sky, and he goes, Alex goes, sound like John Denver. I never forget it. I'm going, yeah, what's wrong with that? John's a bad mother. Boop. Shut your mouth. But I'm talking about John. And anyway, it was just such a funny reaction. And after we recorded, Eddie played bass on that song, on the whole Never Say Goodbye. And Alex heard it on the record. He goes, hey, man, you should have saved that for Van Halen. I said, dude, don't you remember what you said about that song?
The reason I play that clip is because that is interesting because, okay, you're Geffen Records, right? So you're going to get a little bit more popular off this whole album because he's with Van Halen. But how do you really know if he's saving what type of songs for Van Halen versus like his solo? Like is he saving like all the great ones? And the reason I came up with that because like Alex Van Halen said, hey, how come you didn't save that for a Van Halen album? So I wonder, do you know if like, is there any songs like OU 182 that Sammy just said, no, this song's too good. I'm going to save it for Van Halen, And what was it like for an executive producer from Geffen? Like, are we getting all the great songs or is he saving some of it? You know what I mean? That is so interesting during that time. And did the Van Halen brothers, because he didn't say Alex, when I looked at the credits, there's nothing about Michael Anthony or Alex being on that solo album. It was just all Eddie. Was there any aggression that you know of because of that situation?
Well, this also points to Edwards taking the path of least resistance. So you have a singer come into your band and he's still pursuing a solo career like that? To me, it's insane.
It's weird, right? Weird.
It's beyond weird. It's insanity. I just don't get it. And what that says to me, and Sammy Hagar fans are going to jump down my throat, what that says to me is that Sammy Hagar was never invested 1,000% in Van Halen, that he always had a foot in his solo career. And people will say, oh, well, he had the deal on Geffen, he couldn't get out of the deal. Fuck that. You can get out of any deal you want.
Out of deals.
He could have paid them off. They could, as it is, Geffen gets got a piece of Sammy in Van Halen. I don't know what the deal was. But there's another situation of Edward letting it go. Hey man, I'm going to come into your band, but I'm going to still keep my solo career, and I'm going to make a solo record down the road. And what does Edward do? He plays bass and guitar and co-writes. And why did he do that? because Edward didn't want to say, you are not going to do that. You're going to either be in the band or you're going to have a solo career. And ultimately, that's what happened, because Sammy was spending more time on his solo career, and that's ultimately where that split came. Sammy wouldn't come in and do the Twister songs for the movie. Again, who knows where the actual truth lies? It's always in the middle somewhere. But Edward had enough. He'd call him up, and again, I write about this at length in the book. And he goes, Sammy, is it your solo career or the band? Solo career or the band? And Sammy never committed. So again, that translates into the ultimate disrespect. Getting back to your question, Eric, about did Sammy keep the best songs for himself or give the best songs to Van Halen? I don't think that ever happened. I think it was totally separate. He had the songs for his solo career that went on that record. Yes, he happened to play the one song for Alex, which Alex couldn't hear. And I get it. It does sound like a John Denver song, and not a very good one. But that's just me. But yeah, how Edward allowed that. And Edward said to me, at one time, he goes, yeah, man, it's confusing. People don't know if this new blonde-haired singer, referring to Sammy, is just coming in to do one album, or he's going to go take off on a solo career again, referring to the confusion with Dave and the solo. So
all it was almost like a fallback plan. It's like, because Sammy's always a business like, well, if he doesn't work with this, I at least still have a contract with Giffen to do a solo album if it doesn't work out here. And if it does work out here, it's a double game winner for him, because more people are going to buy the solo just because he was in Van Halen.
Right. And I hate to be that mercenary about it, but I believe that's really true. And Sammy said at one point about he was more successful in a solo career than he was in Van Halen. That's a ludicrous comment to make.
Yeah, he made comments that he made more money solo versus Halen, but I
also find that difficult to believe, and if that's even remotely true, it's because he was the only person being paid on those records, and with Van Halen, he was splitting it. But still, I find that impossibly hard to believe.
Yeah, because the only way you could profit more versus an album that sold millions to maybe 1 million is if you own like all the rights. But he didn't own all the rights. Giffen owned most of the rights. So there's no way he could have made more because of that. They all made out at the end, but still, I just think that transition part is just so weird and awkward. That's why I wanted to talk to you about it, because how many times you hear another singer going in and they still have a solo album deal, and then half the album's made by another member from that band. You know what I mean? It's almost like it's like a Van Halen 2.5, because I don't know if this is true or not, but is it majority of the Van Halen music was created from Sammy and Eddie versus Mike? I'm not saying Michael and Alex didn't have input, and they did, but most of the input came from those two guys. Would that be correct to say?
I'd say 98%.
98%. A lot of ways you can say the solo is like a 2.5 because Eddie played bass on all the songs.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, Michael. Right. I mean, Michael and Alex were the rhythm section.
Yes.
And they came in and Edward played a riff, or they showed him his ideas on tape, and they put together the groove to the song. That's not considered songwriting, that's arranging. So the truth of it is you shouldn't share in the songwriting aspect. However, we all know that for those first 6 records, Edward split publishing between all 4 of them, which 25%. Was an incredibly generous thing to do. Look, he was never gonna deny Alex a piece of the songwriting, whether Alex wrote one note
that's
on any record. But after 1984, they changed the songwriting structure. I think that's fair. You're doing all that fucking work, and Dave and Edward. That's just the mechanics of songwriting. One guy writes lyrics, one guy writes music, and you split it 50-50, right? The Beatles, You think about the Beatles, and they allowed, which is very generous. I think, they allowed uh, uh, George. I think George Harrison was allowed to write one song per record, and I think they cut Ringo in maybe on one song on each record because he sang a song on each album. But I mean, come on, it's Lennon and McCartney. It's Roger Daltrey and Pete Townsend. John Entwistle would once in a while come in with a song, and he got his songwriting royalties. But yeah, man, that's just the way it is.
Yeah, because all the stories you always hear during the Sammy era is Sammy called or Eddie called Sammy, hey, I got this. Hey, I got this. I got this. It's always those two. I got this and I got this. And you don't hear too much at the rhythm section say, hey, we got this. It was always the stories was always Eddie and Sammy, had the music ready.
Absolutely. And again, there's a really, really interesting conversation I had with Edward. And he's talking about Michael, and he prefaces the whole thing, man, I love Mike, I get it, he's important in the band, I get it, and he said, just once I wish he called me up, and wanted to come over and hang out and jam a little bit and play a little bit. And he goes, I wish Mike would come up with more ideas. And I said, well, man, he's probably intimidated. And by then the band had been together about 7 or 8 years. And Edward's response is, well, man, it's been 7 years. Get over it. In Edward's head, and again, it goes back to respect. It wasn't that he wanted Michael to come in with the greatest bass riffs that had ever been heard. He just wanted Michael to do that. He wanted Michael to show him, I love this band so much, I'm going to come into you, Edward, with some ideas. That's all Edward wanted. And I believe that had Mike done that, and look, I'm not trying to get inside Michael's head, because I don't know. But I think had Michael done that, I think Edward would have embraced those ideas and turned them into something. And Michael could have really been a legitimate part of the songwriting. But Michael never did that. And again, was Mike intimidated? Maybe. Do I understand that? Fuck yes. Because there's a couple of times in the book, when, not that I'm trying to compare myself to
but Eddie
Mike
and Sammy are hard characters. David Lee Roth, a hard character. He's not on that same level as they are, personality wise. I'm talking about personality, being out there, being loud.
Right. And talk about that intimidation thing. There were a couple of times when Edward, he would actually come over to my pad in the Hollywood Hills, and I was working on a couple of songs one night, and he sat there and he starts working on the songs. And I'm thinking, oh my God, this is insanity, and talk about being intimidated. My God, again, I'm not trying to compare myself to Michael Anthony being in the band with me, showing Edward some ideas, but I get the idea of intimidation. Look, I think anybody who was ever around Edward was intimidated, whether they would admit it or not. I'm talking about other great guitar players who knew him or were friends with him. I know he was just one of those people, But yeah, with Michael,
what's the true story part of because like I said, I don't believe everything I hear from the media. I like to hear from people who knows close to the band. So when Eddie decided that they're going to go back out, Wolfgang is going to be a member of Van Halen. Is it true that Michael Anthony learned about it through the news? They never called him and said, hey, you're not in the band no more. Is there any truth to that? Did that really happen, or is that blown over proportion from media?
Honestly, that happened sort of after I had any kind of a relationship with Edward. So I don't know. Someone made a comment here. That's absolutely BS, in my opinion. They fucked Mikey. I'm assuming this person is referring to what we just spoke about. I'll tell you how they fucked Mikey. Did I think it was unfair that Mike should get a lesser split after the 1984 record as a songwriter? No, I think that was totally fair. What was not fair was taking Mike off those songwriting credits after the fact and erasing his name. I thought that was petty. and amateurish, and that should have never happened. I don't care what Mike did or did not do on those records. You just don't do that. That to me, I thought was horrible and was an incredible insult to all the time and energy Michael did devote to that band. That was horrible. I have never look. I love Edward Van Halen. I think in my mind, I think he was the most influential guitar player who ever lived. Now, I think the greatest guitar player who ever lived was Jeff Beck. I think the most influential guitar player who ever lived was Edward Van Halen, more so than Jimi Hendrix. And I say that because Edward's career covered both the analog eras, right, regular vinyl, and extended into the digital age. So instead of reaching 50,000 or 100,000 fans, you're now reaching 10 million people. And because of that, his influence was vastly larger than someone like Jimi Hendrix or Jimmy Page. The point being, I don't think I ever heard, and maybe if someone out there in the audience knows about it, let me know, where that has happened, where a person who was in the band legitimately had his name on a songwriting credit was later removed.
Now,
I can't think of another band.
Are you saying that? Okay, so he removed the name, but I can't. I don't understand. I'm not saying I know about how the laws work, how contracts work. If he removed the name, you can't remove his percentage pay, right? Because that's already.
That's the question. I don't know about. I think to do that would involve incredible lawyers and legalities. But so I believe you're right, Eric. I think that Michael still to this day receives.
Would have to.
He probably does.
But you can't decide. If I made a contract with you 10 years later, hey, I'm removing you from this part of the contract. You can't do that without lawyers and courts and judges.
No. But I can. But obviously, you can take my name off the songwriting.
And the insult of that hurts the worst. It's not about the money.
What an insult! I'm spitting in your face after you've devoted all those years. Interesting. The same person mentioned Mick Taylor, possibly. I think that's a little different situation because I don't think, and again, I might not know for sure. I don't know if Mick's name was ever on the original songwriting credits. And I think you're talking about some of the songs off of Sticky Fingers, maybe. I don't think that Mick's name was ever actually on there as a songwriter. They were certainly Mick's ideas, and maybe Keith and Mick took those ideas. Mick Jagger took the ideas and didn't give him any songwriting credit. I don't know if Mick Taylor's name was actually on the label and then it was taken off later. I don't know that. And if it was, that was a lousy thing to do. But man, it was money makes the world go round, and there you go.
And things do change. It's like, family members fight and you're in a band, you're more of a family versus your family at home because you're on the road, you're there. But now I know we're getting close to the end because, we're all close up to an hour, but real quick, transitioning from them, why didn't it work out with Gary, in your opinion? Did they just not give Gary a chance for a couple albums, or do you know, maybe Eddie? I'm not trying to blame things on drugs. We all know the drug stories and all that, but was it just the band's too far gone to make it work with Gary to try a second album with them? Because it just seemed like there was enough chance with him to see if it could work.
I'm probably the only person in the world who likes that record. I think Gary Cherone.
Not a bad record. I like it better than that last one they did with David.
I absolutely agree with that. I mean, Gary was a great singer. I thought he was a great lyricist. He seemed like a really devoted guy. I interviewed him years later, and he seemed like a good guy. I think he'd probably gone through hell with Nuno, so he knew what to expect in Van Halen. I think that there were several reasons, and you hit on a couple of them, why that record didn't do well. The drug thing in '95 was bad.
Yeah.
I had recognized a change in Edward by the early '90s. He was not that same incredibly open, loving, respectful, caring person that I knew from back in '78. He just was not the same person.
He
I think
looked
everything
different.
had a
So
lot to do with it. There were problems with the label. There were problems internally in the band. There were problems with the marriage. This is my own uh, thought, and I could be entirely wrong. He would be diagnosed a few years later with cancer.
no.
I think that he knew earlier that there was something going on. Maybe it wasn't bad yet, but I think that that may have weighed on him. Again, I could be entirely wrong. And I think beyond that, Van Halen fans were going to say, okay, you know, we love you, Van Halen. Your singer's going to leave. Let's see who you get for your second singer. Sammy comes in, and it becomes sort of a Van Halen Mach 2. The music is so different. There's more keyboards. We go, okay, we like this. We're going to embrace that. A third singer? No. We don't care who you bring in. We will not settle for a third singer. Yeah, the label wasn't going to give them a chance for a second record. I think there was a second record done or partially recorded. Yeah, it was unfair. I'm sorry, Gary was kicked to the curb, but he just had no chance. And what I find, again, which goes back to Edward taking the path of least resistance, is subsequently Edward gets back with Dave for reunion tours. Are you
And that
kidding?
was Wolfgang's idea, wasn't it? Wasn't it when he joined the band? Said, hey, we need to get David. I mean, I don't know if this is true or not.
I honestly, that I don't know, because this was after my friendship ended. To me, that is, I don't get it. Why would you do that? I mean, some of the things that Edward would tell me about Dave, and again, this stuff's in the book. I don't get it. And Sammy, why would you do that? And I think that I don't get it. A different kind of Truth record.
I always wonder, because that record, technically, according to the sales, only sold 40,000 copies. And I always wonder if they did an album that year with Sammy, would have done better? Because Sammy still had that solo crowd that still follows him. Like would an album with him would have done better than that album? I mean, we'll never know. But I'm always curious. But it's still strange to me to this day, with all the recordings they have with Eddie playing the background and stuff, why they still haven't released instrumental of Eddie playing. That he's got thousands of recordings. I'm just
I will sort of answer that in sort of closing here, maybe. Again, it goes to I don't think Edward never had a sense of himself as this legendary guitar player. He never referred to himself like that. He never saw himself like that. He knew he was a very good guitar player. He was very self-assured in that respect, but that ego thing was never there. Real quickly, in '86, I was going to write Edward's authorized biography. That never happened for various reasons. Edward never wanted to sit down and do all these other interviews, but I don't think that Edward had any sense that his legacy was that important, or that a book had any importance in his legacy. I'm not saying a book made or didn't make his legacy, but he just didn't see the importance of it. So you fast forward all these years, and yes, there's all this music sitting there. I don't think that the Van Halen, I don't know who is there, who has the key to that vault. There's no sense of the importance of the music that's sitting there. Where's the CD box set?
yes.
Can you imagine what that would be? There's a box set on every obscure band who ever sat in front of a microphone. There's no box set. There's no tribute concert. And to me, that's an insult I think it's an insult to fans if you care about your fans at all. Does a band owe anything to its fans? I don't know, man. Without the fans, you're not a band, right?
Yeah,
You're
you
playing
couldn't live
music
the
in a band.
lifestyle that you did. You couldn't do all the recordings if it wasn't for the fans. And I mean, Van Halen made tons of albums, and wouldn't have happened without the fans from the beginning to the end.
Yeah, so I think it's a disappointment.
It is.
It's a black mark against the legacy of the band, is what I believe.
Some
So
of these bands that have remaster albums, they just put a bunch of Kiss done it a lot, like a bunch of just live tracks. Did they have real tracks recorded that does not have to be live? I mean, the stuff they could put on these albums, the 20, 50, 100 extra songs, and people will eat that up because people are dying for Van Halen content. Like, here's something new. Not just that one thing that Alex played, that one intro, for his book. Give us an album. It would do so well because people are dying and craving for real music, for real rock music. It's not
yeah,
dead. It's alive. We just don't see it. And his
yeah,
legacy will always be pushed forward no matter what.
yeah, and maybe someday. Seems a little unlikely at this point, but yeah. So just
Yes.
have to be happy with the records they made, and the little bits and pieces that pop up online from time to time.
And again, people, let me put this here. Just go to tonechaserbook.com. I mean, Steven's got recordings of interviews. I mean, he's got so much good stuff about him and Eddie's time together. I truly recommend every single one of you. He's got an audio book of it. He's got a hardcover. I mean, you got late night phone calls, what you call the Twilight tapes. I mean, you got a lot of good materials in that book, and I recommend every single one of you to go get it. And Steven, just I love having you on. I had to have you back on because I don't have to script questions or anything. We could just talk because we love the music. Just get honest about it, and I always want to do some clarification. I know media makes up half the stuff. You know what I mean? I can't see David being that low to have another band ready before he quit. I just didn't see it, but I wanted to know for 100%, and I'm glad you clarified that because everything you hear from the media is not always true.
No, and half the stuff you see, probably 3/4 is all that AI bullshit. So where that stuff comes from is beyond me. I just want to mention one thing here. That song that you're talking about that was that Alex in some of his those promo spots for his book was that song called "Between Us Two," right?
Yeah, I forgot what it's called.
Right. But Edward talks about that song, and somebody pointed this out to me because I wasn't even aware of it in one of the conversations I had, where Alex thought the song was much later in the history of the band, was actually much earlier. And so all these little bits and pieces have come out, people reading my book and stuff that I wasn't even aware of. Some of these hardcore Van Halen guys will go, "Oh my God, that's that song that Alex was talking about was actually, the song was completed, blah, blah, blah." Anyway, I just thought that was pretty interesting. But also in the audio book, I just wanted to mention, there are bits and pieces between us too. There's my buddy Adam Roach. Adam does all my YouTube stuff. I love this guy. He's in Thailand beating up people because he's like a 20th degree black belt and all these different pursuits. So don't make him mad. In the audiobook, you can hear the interviews I've done with Edward dating back to 1978. These actual interviews. There's also little bits of Edward playing, and you can hear him noodling around on guitars and stuff. That's pretty amazing. So, yeah, you guys should check it out.
Yeah, check it out. And I love listening to stuff like that and rewatching old clips because there's always something that makes you rethink certain things. Like, oh wow, I didn't think about that. Oh, I forgot all about that. So I love going back. And Steve, you're awesome. I mean, you're awesome. Are you doing anything coming up that you want everybody to know? Like you're going on another show, you're doing something you want people to see?
Actually, this Saturday I'm doing a show, Hell Yeah Radio, which is actually just a radio, it's just audio. Should be interesting. Um, I want to say that the audio books are now available on a bunch of other formats besides my website, which is the same where you can get the hardback, tonechaserbook.com. So you can now find it on Spotify and Apple, and it's all around. So go check that out. And
Yeah, it's even on. You can even get it on eBay, Sweetwater. There's so many places that you could get it. So it's
yeah,
yeah,
that's the hardback. Yeah, so the audio book is available all over. Yeah, so you can also get the audio book. I'm sorry, you can also get the hardback. Yes, on eBay, Reverb, Amazon, Sweetwater. Did I say that?
yeah.
You can actually get it on the Book Soup, which is a great bookstore out in West Hollywood. They sell a book, so it's all around. And anybody who doesn't have it, I want to know why not. So go buy it.
Go by. All right. So everybody, thank you guys for watching. Today at 2 p.m., I got another Eddie Van Halen short. Anytime I do a Van Halen show, all my shorts that day is Eddie. All the polls that I do that day is Eddie. So I got a poll out right now. Well, Eddie Van Halen, according to him, some of his favorite songs you can vote for. And again, people, YouTube only gives you 4 options. I can't put 5 or 6 or 7 songs. I get that complaint all the time. How come this album's not on there? How come this is not on there? I can only put 4, and I do my best to pick the 4 that maybe they sold more or not. So people, stop getting mad at me. But beyond that, I'll see you guys later next time on Hair Metal Revolution. And then,
See you guys.